Доброе утро, дорогие друзья.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of the Eastern European DNS Forum. It's going to be less technical. Thank you for coming here at 10 p.m. despite the fact that it's too early. I hope that today is going to be as productive as yesterday, which was a technical day. Let me remind you that yesterday we discussed the most urgent technical issues such as prevention of DNS abuse, and we even touched upon such topic as the philosophy of DNS use. And actually, it's a good bridge to bridge the gap between yesterday and today, because we'll be discussing lots of urgent topics such as the legal issues pertaining to DNS use and so on and so forth. We have already mentioned that the national governments are becoming more involved in the internet governance and the domain industry in general. A few years ago, it was difficult to imagine that such events would be attended by governmental officials. The paradigm has changed, and like I said, today is going to be less technical, and it's my pleasure to give the floor to Leonid Levin, Chairman of the Committee for Information Policy, IT and Communications, the Russian State Duma. He is a member of parliament, and actually Leonid is a member of the Ratsid, which is one of the oldest public watchdogs that follows the internet development, as well as the recently founded Internet Development Institute. Leonid, the floor is yours. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, participants in the DNS Forum. Well, I guess most of you do not have to deal with governmental officials too often. Maybe when you have to get your passport or some ID. But otherwise, you don't deal with governmental officials. So from the very outset, I'd like to mention that I'm not here to try to govern the internet industry. We are here to, I'm here to jointly with you develop some solutions to the common problems, because the public engagement principles should be the cornerstone of our joint collaboration, and I hope that the government jointly with the internet community will team up to develop the guiding principles. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Russian State Duma, I'd like to welcome you to the Eastern European DNS Forum, which is one of the most important venues. It's another pleasure for me to emphasize that Moscow is hosting the DNS Forum. Russia is one of the leading countries in the internet industry. Since the Soviet era, the government has been paying close attention to developing IT technologies, IT-based education. We have our own social media, search engines, and national software solutions, including antiviral software, which is highly competitive across the world. When the Russian domain appeared 25 years ago, Russia has started following the multi-stakeholderism approach, and we participate on a par in developing high-tech technologies, and both the governmental bodies and high-tech companies. The outcome is the high penetration of IT technologies in all walks of life in Russia. Over 80% of the Russian population have access to the internet, and among the youth, the penetration is almost 98%. Mobile banks, logistics, marketing, and even the urban environment are managed by neural networks, which is an ordinary thing for Russia. In the international arena, Russia
отраслевых форумов, где участвуют общественные объединения и частные корпорации, до межпарламентской работы на площадках ООН и Международного союза электросвязи. Эта работа встречает понимание и поддержку.
UN bodies and Internet Governance Forum. The most recent example is that the Committee of the UN General Assembly approved the Russian initiative on developing an Internet governance code. The IGF forum was held in Paris in November, and the French President Emmanuel Macron stated the initiative on improving the cyber security in the internet, and his initiative coincides with Russia's stance. The skyrocketing growth of the internet, combined with the development of such technologies as blockchain, IoT, as well as satellite-based internet access, resulted in an ever-increasing number of various threats and challenges. A couple of years ago, cyber criminals focused on banking accounts and credit cards held by physical people. Right now, most of the attacks are focusing on the critical infrastructure facilities, and most of the criminal organizations carry out attacks against such facilities. Root servers are a global asset, and their sustainable operation is the foundation of the entire global network. Global standards, global architecture, and global interconnection are one of the most important goals facing the humankind. Another important task is to generate innovative ideas to be approved by the governmental bodies. Only through joint efforts will we be able to establish the right environment to maximize the benefits of using the internet technologies to boost economic growth and ensure the real digital transformation of the national economy. Russia is highly interested in developing collaboration with various international organizations focusing on a wide range of various issues, such as improving the stability and sustainability of the internet, in cybersecurity, and developing guidances. Creating a cyber UN could be a way out. We could use the UN or the International Electronic Communications Forum as the main venue, and this body would develop the most relevant guidances to be followed by various nations and organizations. But primarily, these issues should be dealt by such public fora as this particular forum. And in this regard, I'd like to wish you every success, productive work, interesting networking, and I hope that the solutions that you will develop during the day will facilitate further development of the namespace and the internet in general. Thank you for your attention. It was my pleasure to be able to address you. Once again, I wish you every success and a very productive day. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite clear that we're facing significant challenges both within the framework of this forum and in the follow-up days. The national government faces a wider range of issues, a broader range of issues that Leonid touched upon. But as far as the domain industry is concerned, our primary task is to ensure stability and security of the global internet identifier systems. As far as Russia is concerned, we're talking about a plethora of various subsystems and different stakeholders try different approaches to ensure stability and security. And this particular event is one of the venues that will help us to share our experience on the way we use various approaches. Yesterday was a very technical day. Some of you attended the forum yesterday. I hope you had a chance to network with each other, and well, it seems to me that the agenda was quite intensive yesterday as well. ICANN and the Coordination Center of the .ru and .rf believed that the agenda comprised the most relevant topics, such as the root zone stability, EEDNS, and universal acceptance. I have no idea how to properly interpret it into Russian. We also talked about the DNS encryption. These are the most relevant topics which we've been discussing for quite some time. It's worth mentioning that the main goal of today's event is not just to promote ICANN's mission or the Coordination Center's mission. Our objective is to generate a higher level of interest among all the stakeholders, and I hope you will be heavily engaged in various regional and global processes that were singled out by Mr. Levin just a couple of minutes ago. When the Eastern European DNS Forum came into existence in 2016, we decided to allocate a whole of 2 days to discuss the issues that are relevant for Russia and the region. And the second day would be devoted to policy development issues. The policy development issues do not generate as heated debates as the technical issues do, but they are as relevant to the domain industry development as the technical ones. I hope that ICANN colleagues, and there are a total of 8 of them here, and all of you will be able to discuss policy development. I hope that you will find the agenda interesting. We will be discussing such things as the international cooperation in tackling the DNS abuse. It's one of the most urgent topics. Another question that we'd like to raise is the transborder effects of national legislation on the internet development in general. Yet another issue that we would like to raise is the way the regional and the Russian communities are involved in developing the global domain governance policies to bridge the gap between session 1 and the opening remarks. I'd like to mention that ICANN has recently celebrated its 20th anniversary at it happened in Barcelona at the 63rd meeting of ICANN, and .ru domain is going to celebrate its 25th anniversary next year. So in hindsight, we should discuss the DNS in retrospect, the global history through a regional lens. That's the title of our next session. And I'd like to thank all of you for participation in advance. Even if you are not interested in discussing any of these topics, you will still have a chance to network with each other and discuss the most pressing issues. And I wish you a very productive day. Thank you.
Так, слышно меня? Очень хорошо. Я буду вести круглый.
Well, I'm going to be your facilitator for the upcoming roundtable, and I'd like to invite to the stage Елена Voronina. Please come out front to the stage. Alexei, Alexey Soldatov, Dmitry Burkov, will you please join me on the stage? And David Conrad, please join me on the stage.
Так, коллеги, пожалуйста.
Well, the organizers of the forum asked me an impossible thing. On the one hand, they asked me to provide everyone with a historical overview. By the way, if you have any questions, don't be shy, please raise your hand. We want this session to be as interactive as possible. So, on the other hand, they wanted me to discuss specific issues pertaining to the namespace industry and domains in general. It's quite a challenging task, but I hope we'll be able to cope with it. For starters, I just wanted to set the time frame that we will be discussing during this roundtable, and then I will specify the milestones on the time frame. It was up to me, so don't be too critical. If you want to discuss some other events, you are more than welcome to do so. So the very first milestone that I would like to single out is November 1983. Because back then, RFCs 881, 882, and 883, authored by John Pastel, and actually served as the starting point of the domain style names. The word style was omitted later on, and after that, the RFCs started using the domain names definition. The next milestone has nothing to do with domains per se, but it had a huge impact on developing the domains technologies. I'm talking about 1991, when the first website appeared. A very famous inventor came up with something that became a real breakthrough in the world. In 1991, the first website appeared, and in 1993, the global traffic increased 1,000-fold. And actually, this event became a real breakthrough for the internet development. In 1998, the first ccTLD.su was registered, and as far as I remember, it was Mr. Antonov who formally registered the .su domain. The next milestone was the registration of the .ru domain, and Leonid Levin was right in point now that .ru is going to celebrate its 25th anniversary next year, because actually, it was registered, it was activated in 1994, but on the 4th of November 1993, it was actually registered when the .ru register agreement was signed, and it was signed by a total of 17 parties. The Russian participants in the process struck a deal on how to operate and administer the .ru domain. Unfortunately, Alexey Platonov was unable to join us today, but he was head of the Coordination Center back then, and he made a huge personal contribution to striking this deal, and I believe that the credit should go to him. Personally, I'm extremely grateful to him for that. 1998 is another milestone because back then ICANN was created. As mentioned, 20 years ago, ICANN was created, and it was an outcome of a very, very long process that took place primarily in the US. A couple of years ago, I attended the Los Angeles-based ICANN meeting, and I heard lots of interesting things from U.S. officials. So back in 1998, ICANN came into existence, and I believe that 1998 is yet another milestone in internalizing DNS names and identifiers, because everything started back in the year of 1990 when we started internalizing IP addresses distribution, and when the first regional registries, internet registries started appearing, starting with the European RIR and ending with the African registry. Well, the next milestone is the appearance of .rf domain, and August 2016 is the appearance of the public technical identifiers. PTI was deciphered in one way first, then in another way. It's another milestone in developing the domain technologies and namespace industry.
No.
That's essentially your timeline, right? If I could add something, please. Well, 94 or 95, they actually had 3 simultaneous events. One, www, launched in Europe. Communications sector was deregulated. It used to be one operator, one country, or one country, one operator, rather. And the third event is internet privatization in the U.S. Moderator speaking. So here's your historical background. Now we will ask 3 questions, and our colleagues on stage will respond to those, and then the audience will also have a chance to respond. So the domain name as an idea was first expressed 35 years ago, right? So it's been 35 years. The concept has been proven. It became obvious that there are some weak points, but we've got secure DNS that's being developed and stuff. But really, why did this idea become a success? Were there some advantages, disadvantages to it? Could something else have happened? Could it have evolved differently? So let's discuss this, because it's important to figure out how that technology evolved, starting in the several decades ago. Elena, please. Elena, I will respond about the success factor. I think it's not the technical side of things, but really the idea itself that made it successful. The technology behind it was a means to create a more friendly way to communicate between humans and computers. Internet itself, I think it's just another way for humankind to be free, right? We are kind of part of this sort of worldwide brain or intelligence that we are part of, and DNS enables this. And DNS is the way to interact with this intellect. Alexei. Well, so I will note several factors here. It's the protocol first because there is internet protocol, but there are several others. Specifically, there was a very serious argument going on at some point. Is it's internet protocol or IS-25? And so I believe it's not the technical side of things that was internet protocol was chosen for. It was to make sure. The idea was to write the design and then to implement it, right? You can keep improving things in the internet, right? You can keep working on it. You can keep building it out, right? So technical side was also important. Moderator, what the domain name? What role does it play in the technical space? Alexei, well, domain names are really mnemonic devices, if you will. Right? I mean, it's kind of like imagine a city without street names, but street numbers only, right? Streets are just numbers. That would be difficult, right? You would have to remember all the numbers. Same story here, and so domain names made it easier to create the network and, most importantly, to use it. And then if we think about governance, that's a separate issue. Dmitry, please. Dmitry, well, when you're lazy, that's what laziness moves things forward. Laziness is progress. So before, well, there was Jeeves as a while ago. BSD 4.2, I don't even remember that part, right? There is BSD 43, right? Everybody forgot about very simple things. TCP/IP wouldn't have been possible without technology on analog lines. It's just that it was the most optimized communications technologies that were being used. By the end of the 80s, you've got T1. There were some radical changes done in 94. But everybody forgets about it. But back then it was 155 megabytes and the first stems, and that's that whole layer, and then the regulation part, both in the U.S., and that happened in '96 thanks to Clinton's initiatives, and in Europe it was '93 with the move away from government monopolies. But really, and also there is Ethernet, right? At the beginning of the 80s, it was the rise of the Ethernet, because and if that didn't happen on university campuses, well, nothing would be happened. So really, they didn't do anything groundbreaking at CERN. I think history is being rewritten all the time. Well, yeah, it's the victors who write history, right? For me, internet is a marketing word. Everyone forgets that internet is still a network of networks, right? And everyone is surprised at transparency going away. It's normal because we have thousands of networks with thousands of operators interacting with each other, and then you've got like businesses interacting. So really, it's a multi-layer system. It's complex and it's evolving. Moderator, right? I understand, but really, the main names, what role do they play? Was there an alternative to them? Something that there was their crossing point, right? We took one. We went one way, but we could have gone some other way. Dmitry, well, I'm sure that the internet will continue existing for another 30, 50 years, but I think that everything will change. David was saying yesterday that, this solution is risky, this other one is also risky, but risks are for existing organizations, not for the system itself. Okay, thank you. David, please go ahead.
When the domain name system was first being developed, it was actually in competition with a number of other naming systems. One of the ones that I think folks here may be familiar with was the X400 and X500 set of naming standards that came out of the CCITT and ISO. And I think one of the core underlying reasons why the domain name system actually initially took off was the delegation of authority, the ability to push down the administration of the namespace down closer to the people who actually needed to use the names. And with the DNS, even at the top level, the administration was done in a very decentralized fashion. That was in contrast to the X400, X500 systems that still relied on a very centralized approach for the allocation of names and the administration of names, working with government bodies in order to allocate the different names. This decentralized approach that the domain name system actually used made it much more agile, much more adaptable to the network as it was growing, and thereby sort of provided a way for the experimenters and for the people who are trying to develop the network to actually sort of move forward much more quickly. Relying sort of on the concepts that are sort of, I think, generally known as permissionless innovation for today. Ultimately, I think the DNS is a tool that has a lot of warts. It's showing its age. It has a bunch of areas in which it could be vastly improved, but it works well enough for people to continue to make use of it, and will undoubtedly remain sort of viable as a layer that allows for people who just want to use the internet to be able to communicate more easily, more effectively, without having to understand how things actually work.
Thank you. So consistent technology, but independent layers.
Yes, exactly.
Free to move
To innovate,
inside layer,
yes, right.
but very strict rules from the top to the bottom, yeah?
Right, very consistent set of rules that apply across the namespace, but which allow within any particular layer of the namespace for innovation to occur.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Ну, вот разные взгляды, как мне кажется, высказаны.
Moderator speaking. So I think we have several different views about the same thing. So essentially we've got a sort of technical unity here, right, that was built into the domain names, not just into that part of internet, but into everything else, into IP as a protocol that will allow for absolute transparency, sort of door to door. So it feels like it was simplicity and independent administration that ensured this success. So, dear colleagues, anyone from the audience would like to ask additional questions, or shall we do that later? Later, fine. Next question, or so next point on the timeline. ICANN was created 20 years ago. The goal was to ensure resilience and stability of internet of the internet identifiers, and ICANN is sort of this body, but for domain names and the IANA function, that is its main function. So something that used to be done by one person, John Pastel, who had a personal contract signed with the U.S. government, It was amazing. I read the contract myself. There was just one person signing a contract to perform these functions. So that was 20 years ago. What are the objectives that have to do with domain names, and which ones of them are being successfully executed, which ones aren't, maybe? You've got, in addition to TLDs, you've got CCs, you've got regional domain names, right? .Moscow, for example, .Moskva. So what are your thoughts? Maybe David, maybe you could respond here. You represent ICANN and IANA, maybe things that are yet to be achieved and what has already been achieved. Thank you.
So the DNS is matured, and ICANN's had some role in sort of shepherding some of the events. I think the new GTLD program allowed for a diversification of the namespace to far beyond what any of many in the technical community would think was prudent. It allowed for, ICANN has been successful in helping to encourage the development and deployment of the internationalized domain names. I think both of those are indicative of advances, although some would argue that the new GTLD program might not have been the best use of resources. It does allow for anyone to use whatever names they think fits a business model or fits their particular needs. Areas in which ICANN continues to face some challenges, I think we're still working on becoming accepted as an international organization, one that meets the requirements across the various cultures and nations of the world. If you look at the participants at ICANN meetings, the majority still are from developed countries, particularly from the West. It's an area that we're trying to address through increased stakeholder engagement. The operational side of ICANN still, from the IANA functions perspective, I think is no longer considered part of the problem. When I first started at ICANN back in 2005, a lot of people were concerned about the IANA functions continuing to function correctly, but that no longer seems to be a concern, particularly post the transition. There seems to be a general feeling that, at least from our perspective, that people are reasonably happy with the operation of the IANA functions. There are undoubtedly additional changes and structural modifications that could be made to make it better fit the multi-stakeholder community that it serves. But so far, ICANN seems to have been reasonably successful in ensuring the security and stability of the identifier systems it helps coordinate.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit details how the PTI as a technical division working? It is interesting, I suppose, for all, and this is also the theme to think about what will be new about coexistence with the audience, with all other participants.
So the operation of PTI is actually minimally boring. We don't actually have, it's basically making changes to about 2,500 different databases. It's mostly an administrative task that has at its heart simple database functions that are intrinsically not particularly interesting. Where things become more interesting is when PTI starts interacting with the sort of the global political sphere. And where things get a little complicated is when the operation of particularly top-level domains becomes a political football between parties within a country or between countries. In that sense, the PTI acts as sort of just a neutral playing field that enables folks who have different opinions to actually try to come to some sort of mutual agreement because changes can't, a rule that was imposed by John Postel long ago is that you can't make changes unless all the parties agree. And that continues to be a core aspect of the way the PTI operates. Other than that, the operation of the IANA functions, actually, the only significant difference now since the transition has been it's in one way slightly more efficient in that there wasn't this little bump where all requests for changes to the root zone had to get approval by the Department of Commerce. But it's also more complicated because in the past, the folks that the IANA staff had to report to were limited to ICANN staff and the U.S. government and the various community members. Today, there are now a new myriad of acronyms that the PTI team must report to: the CSC, the RZERC, the IANA function review, along with the traditional folks that the PTI team needed to provide input to: the CCNSO, the GNSO, the RARs, and others. So largely, things are both simpler and more complicated at the same time.
Thank you. Dim, пожалуйста.
Dmitry, please.
Bad question. When PTI will have staff? Because PTI has a board,
Yes.
but no staff. Because it's still IANA department division staff.
So currently, the staff of PTI are seconded. They're ICANN employees seconded to PTI for as part of the transition agreement. That's something that is, I forget when that secondment ends, but the intention is that the staff will transition over to PTI at the end of the secondment. I think it's within 6 months or a year. I don't remember the exact date.
It was an issue even during discussion of IANA transition because, you remember what Elise told us about some issues with staff. And this is still a problem.
Right. So today, there's sort of just a general acceptance that will occur unless the community or the board sees fit to change the progression forward with the transition of the staff from ICANN employees to PTI employees directly. Obviously, that provides for some level of nervousness on the part of the staff. They largely feel, in speaking with them, they felt comfortable with working at ICANN, so that moving them over to a new organization is always, change is always scary. But we're working with the staff to ensure that there's no significant distress when the transition does occur.
Thank you, спасибо. Дим, теперь ты скажи несколько слов, пожалуйста. Вот, собственно, ICANN, как скажешь?
Dmitry, please go ahead. Well, really, things started earlier, right? ICANN is a product of the involvement and meddling of the U.S. in network, in the internet. Obviously, there was a need for some sort of a coordination and an umbrella when internet became privatized. Before that, there was Internet Society that was created because there were about 10 people worldwide. ISOC, right? That was ISOC. There was I call those people kind of juntas, right? It was like a junta of technical people, so technical junta, right? So this techno junta, they founded ISOC, and then Ira Magaziner, he was very openly talking about these things today. He then said there will not be ISOC. We are taking over. ISOC will not be heading the internet. We are launching our own thing here. Washington lawyers over a couple of years, they trained me very well. I learned a lot of things. The best legal forces were put in place. There was a bunch of white papers and other papers, and that's when ICANN was launched. I see it as a sort of diplomatic démarche, diplomatic attempt to test some of the officials, and I felt that this is a way to kind of see if there is an alternative to ICANN. To see if you can move away from intergovernmental relationship and to move away to a new model where there are new players and things become more complicated. I understand that working in this particular format creates more resources. It's just a expensive thing. I'm just looking at this from the market standpoint, right? You create barriers to entry, right? How do you get on the entry? You have to pay a ticket. Like internet governance, same story. To become a leader in internet governance requires resources. At that point, those resources were concentrated in one point. These days, moving into modern times, right? There are new players on the field, national-based. For example, China is doing it. You've got China, right? And you've got Europe. Europe created this package of new approaches, but it will keep happening in the next 2 years. They will be using the same principles as the EU is based on, and this is all protection of own interests. Moderator. Well, what Europe is doing something above that, Dmitry. Well, everyone is looking at Macron, but really you should have read or listened to his speech. Those who were present at IGF, we were astounded. Things that he was calling for at IGF, well, they explain much better their position, because imagining that the European administration, that they let everything just happen on its own, that's strange. Moderator. Okay, let's go back to the question I was trying to ask. So ICANN was created 20 years ago. Did they achieve their objectives? Dmitry, it almost died right at the get-go. So ISOC and IETF moved away. They just started being a liaison. Internet Society, they got .org, and they said they would support IETF because, well, .org used to exist even before that, and IETF support fund is still in place. Resources meant for that .org, they went to ISOC. So, moving on to ICANN. ICANN survived, but barely. In 2002, right, regional registries, they created an NRO that was kind of a backup emergency solution. So the NRO was created. to make sure the function will continue being performed. Because, I mean, for ISPs, ICANN, well, really, a lot of people worldwide don't know about ICANN and won't know because no one actually needs it. Moderator, well, David was saying about why this was important. Back to Dmitry. Really, ICANN, it was kind of this interface, like grease, right, between the U.S. Government and some of the players. So in the end, we got a compromise. That is ICANN. ICANN's main thrust of activity is tied to DNS. We'll see what we'll see in the future, because some people are kind of trying to kind of pull more forces towards IGF, which Macron was talking about. So that will be interesting to see how that evolves. Alexei, please go ahead.
Well, the first thing worth mentioning is that indeed everything is quite rational. Everything you have mentioned is quite rational. Since the internet is still operational, that means the functions are properly done by ICANN. However, we have to identify the criteria that we should judge the operation of the internet, because the operators, the end users, and the governments might have a different perception of the parameters to be used. But the internet still functions. Well, I personally believe that ICANN copes with its functions pretty well. It faces some challenges, but by and large, I believe that resilience, stability, and so on and so forth is something that it does well enough. Elena, what do you think? Well, I would leave the political issues aside, and let's be pragmatic about that. The further we go, the more internet becomes a business, and it becomes a business tool, if you will, because many companies that have nothing to do with the internet governance use the internet. What are the main requirements to be met by a tool? It should be reliable, it should function so that the core activities of commercial companies are not affected by any shutdowns. As for the domain name industry that we are discussing, its requirements the requirements it faces are predefined by the requirements identified by the commercial companies. Registries, registrars, DNS operators are various stakeholders. Data escrow companies is another aspect that we should keep in mind. This division is quite proper. Technically wise, we can merge everything into one thing and shift the entire burden to a single organization. However, the SLA for each and every stakeholder is something that ensures the stability of the industry in general and allows the internet to stay a tool for the commercial companies and businesses. And I believe that ICANN embraced a very right approach because it split the responsibilities. Are there any regional features? Well, the division is quite clear, but is there any freedom of action within the regional package, if you will? What's the difference between Eastern Europe, Russia, and as compared with the US or any other regions? It goes without saying that business is an international phenomena, and we have to follow the laws of the country where we carry out our business. it's worth establishing a dialogue with ICANN so that national peculiarities do not conflict with ICANN rules and standards. This is a very important point you touched upon. There will be a separate discussion of this issue because striking a balance between the regional interests and the international or global interest is really important. I'd like to address the following question to you. It's closely connected with the previous one. 2 decades ago, we started playing around with an idea of creating our own regional DNS systems. Right now, we have just a single domain name system, which is governed by ICANN as the top-level organization, and then everything is broken down into various layers, which are relevantly independent. However, people have been toying around with ideas of creating their own DNS systems. A couple of years ago, someone came up with this idea. And I read up on that, and I saw that even 2 decades ago, people were toying with these ideas. Is it just an attempt to troll people? Dmitry, you raised your hand. Do you want to say anything? Go ahead. Well, actually, such ideas have always been around because any corporate network has its own links. What domain system are you talking about? Is it ICANN DNS space or it's a non-ICANN DNS space? I'm talking about the one that will stand apart. Well, mobile operators use their own systems to maintain their services. These are local. No, they are not local. They are global. So basically, those operators who use MMS and other services use their own technological platforms. So basically, everything you mentioned exists within various regions. The one DNS system is not about technical issues; it's about money. If you take a closer look at the idea of creating the Great Chinese Firewall, you'll see that the top-level registry will be governed by ICANN. That's great. It's a global administration. The technical support is a totally different matter, such DNS systems already exist. You can scale it up because any company has its own corporate DNS system. But the only issue is how to solve the technical issues. You cannot trust the corporate verification to ICANN because we're talking about DNSSEC and other issues. Do you really think that the US DoD will rely on ICANN? Naturally, the answer is not. We have never used the default settings of the software suites. You probably know why Bind 9 was developed in the first place. Some of the options are not just documented and you don't use it, or you don't have access to some of the settings, but actually it can be done. As for the political discussions carried out by people who have no idea how the technical solutions can be solved, there are lots of them going on around. The critical infrastructure is one of the favorite topics for the non-technical experts. And everything you are saying is another good example. Fragmentation is happening for economic reasons. David wanted to say something. Go ahead.
It's important to make a distinction between the namespace, the names that people find on the internet that are sort of universal across the entire internet, and you want them to be universal across the internet because you don't want someone going to mybank.com to show up at a different place depending on where they're actually issuing the query. So there's this concept of the namespace that the more people who play in the namespace, the more value it has. It's just an example of the network effect. And then there's the implementation of the namespace, how that namespace gets instantiated across the internet. Today, the most common way in which the namespace is implemented is by using the existing 13 root servers, replicating the zone, using caching servers, using the DNS protocol. That's not the only way the namespace can be implemented. There are, as Dimitri points out, in corporate environments, people create their own augmented namespace that's separate from the Internet's namespace, and there's usually a separate view, the internal view versus the external view. The external view is the Internet's namespace, but it's implemented differently depending on which side of the network you're actually trying to query. So the main advantage of the namespace as it is today is that it is universal, that it does give you the same experience regardless of where on the internet you're actually trying to query for that name. And as long as that has value, people will continue to voluntarily use the existing system. When that begins to lose value for whatever reason, then people will begin to look at other approaches to have sort of a user interface to the internet as the DNS sort of provides now.
Thank you, Alexei.
Well, let me put it this way. Like I said, the internet works perfectly fine. So the main question is, are there any people who are willing to go an alternative way? Dmitry mentioned that the economical issues could be at stake. The second part of the problem are government-related issues. For some reason, national governments believe that if they keep interfering in the DNS system, that means that they can govern or manage the internet on the territory of their countries. In Moscow, there is a company whose main task is to keep a list of all the streets in Moscow. If you want to get a new name for an unnamed street, you have to go to this company and get its approval. I guess I can runs the DNS system in a similar way. It's not management per se. It's not governance per se. Naturally, assigning domain names is a business of sorts because of all of the advertising campaigns and so on and so forth. Well, Dmitry already mentioned the critical infrastructure facilities and so on and so forth. Even if all the root servers go down, no one is going to notice that, because there are lots of instances, there are lots of caches, there are lots of proxy servers, and so on and so forth. And 24 hours later, all the root servers will be restored after the failover. But resilience for the DNS system is a crucial point. Resilience is also important for national domain systems. Yelena, would you like to add anything to this effect? How do we ensure sustainability and resilience of the DNS system? Well, let me go at a tangent. Let me clarify something. When you are mentioning alternative DNS systems, you have to keep in mind that we will have to replace a hierarchy with a single root zone. A parallel, well, there are lots of parallel DNS systems running in the world. They are not alternative, they are just parallel. I'm not going to mention the operators, but let me give you the following example. A DNS system used by the GSM carriers. It's a closed DNS system with a totally different root zone. It carries out its business functions, and it's great because DNS is just a technology. And if there are business needs or any other reasons to create a system that would be based on a different root zone, it's not a crime. It's just a business need that needs satisfying. To be more specific on this issue, let me remind everyone. Well, you're all smart experts, but let me remind you anyway, that there is a Google public resolver with the deep cache. And we're talking about 12 to 15% of the entire DNS traffic. Would you call it a parallel DNS system? Is that a question for me? Well, in that case, my answer is no. It's one of the tools inherent in the existing DNS system. That's my personal view. Well, it is a tool, and it can be part of the hierarchy I just mentioned. But nevertheless, it boasts some of the features that could be called features of a parallel DNS system. It seems to me that it's really important to discern between the following two processes. The first one are business needs and the technologies that can be used to satisfy those business needs. And the second pillar are the political and administrative issues that can drive improvement in the stability and resilience. Different people have different understanding of these issues. Various processes have different risks, and there is no silver bullet. One size does not fit all in dealing with the risks. Thank you. There is another question that we have already touched upon and kept mentioning it. Let me phrase it in the following way. There is a conflict of interest between the technological unity, and I'm talking about a single root zone, and the technology has spread across the world because it's a worldwide technology, and we're all enjoying the outcomes of this technology. Well, I would call it logical unity rather than technological unity. Well, technological unity as well, because IP addresses and HTTP protocol are the same regardless of where you are. We can take a different view. The young experts at the IETF say that IP over DNS and over HTTP could be used. There are lots of illiterate people who cause even more problems. Well, what I was driving at is the conflict of interest between the technological unity on the one hand and the sovereignty, the political sovereignty on the other hand. I'm not saying that we should be discussing any political issues. I just wanted to stress that the contradiction is there, and we are trying to deal with it in a very positive way. The fact that ICANN now has the Governmental Advisory Committee, GAC, which comprises 104 different countries and over 40 international organizations, well, at least those organizations that enjoy a status of an international one. Actually, it proves that there is a mechanism for breaching the gap between the efforts to centralize everything and sovereignty, because sovereignty is about division rather than unity. We face this issue all the time in our daily lives, not just during this roundtable. My personal viewpoint is that we are making progress in combating this contradiction. What are your views? And please do not be political. Alexei, go ahead. Well, I've been taking an active part in this process. And the first thing I want to mention is that one of the arguments is that there are lots of bad things on the internet and it should be cleansed. Let me quote Boris Miroshnikov to you. He used to say that the internet was invented by good people, good-willed people for their own selves, and then everyone joined the internet. Boris Miroshnikov is a former general. He's a highly competent person. But what are you driving at? What I'm driving at is that national interests will always contradict global interests, because each and every state will try to protect its own sovereignty no matter how you look at it. Secondly, national legislations always lag behind the technologies. And like I said, this will always cause contradictions. This is business as usual. Let me give you the following example. When the planes appeared in the early 20th century, they were used for airlifting cargo only. What about the customs clearance? What about the passport control? Well, those were the main problems that people started facing. And, well, people came up with a solution, and for people at the turn of the century, it seemed to be a totally moronic solution. Because in the middle of nowhere, countries had to build customs, border guard booths, and so on and so forth. So like I said, there will always be a contradiction between national interests and global interests. You are right in saying that we are making progress. We have to come up with a solution. We can hardly shut down the internet. Some people are saying that the world is going down the drain, and that's just because they're immature. Are you saying that some time will have to pass? Well, like I said, there will always be a lag, but it will be shifting to the right in any case. David, would you like to say anything?
So, I definitely agree that there's a tension between sort of global and national, and sovereign versus a global approach. I think where the internet succeeds is when it provides a common infrastructure that allows different interests to implement their own approaches to addressing their own specific requirements. So, for example, in certain countries, it's illegal to make rude comments about the king. That means that if you are in that country and you make a rude comment about the king on the internet, then you can face some unpleasantries. But if you're outside of the country and you make a comment about the king, I just don't plan on visiting that country again for some time. But you're not bound by the national laws, even though you have violated those laws on an environment that is actually accessible within a country that has some jurisdiction concerns. This is a where it works. This is a level playing field. Where things get sticky is when you start getting competing interests, and particularly in areas that have an impact on the day-to-day living of people, things like DNS abuse or spam or denial of service attacks. The inability for there to be sort of a common set of norms across sort of the global infrastructure is allowing sort of the bad guys to win in some sense. So I think this is an area that will continue to experience a significant amount of tension. I think there are efforts being made across the entire multi-stakeholder environment to try to come up with norms and approaches that will allow for there to be a distinction on this global infrastructure of sovereign interests, but it's something that's going to take some time to actually evolve.
Thank you. Спасибо.
Thank you. Елена, would you like to add anything? Well, let me state a motto. Different countries have lots of things in common. We have one aerospace. We have the same space and the same ocean. Therefore, we will need to find a way to find a mechanism. I hope we'll be able. Well, actually, I'm positive that we'll be able to overcome all the obstacles. Dmitry, would you like to add anything to that, or do you think that we have beaten the horse to the ground? Well, all the initiatives that we've been discussing so far and all the rules and initiatives that people in Europe have been discussing, that's great. But I want to own my own personal data at a technical level. And let me explain what I mean. I totally agree with you, by the way. I'm not arguing against that. At the recent IGF meeting, I talked to Yari Arko and Andrew Sullivan, and actually the channels were shut down. Now we use DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, but the outstanding issue is how do we process data? How do I control access to my own data, regardless of where it is? This is still an outstanding issue. There is an elephant in the room, as the saying goes. Uncontrolled access to my personal data and my personal accounts is something that I'm really concerned about. I hope that we will be able to demonstrate some positive outcomes. This is a separate topic for discussion, but the World Wide Web is going to change a lot in the future. Well, thank you so much. Are there any questions from the floor to our panelists? This gentleman was the first one to raise his hand. Would you please bring him a mic? I'm going to give you my own mic. Good morning, Alexander Samnin. It's a pleasure for me to be able to ask the following question on behalf of the .ru and .rf domains. I've been closely following various domain organizations, and I see that they also shoulder some corporate responsibility. For instance, the Czech Domain and Network Information Center develops the software that can be used by .su or MSK-IX for routing. The Dutch domain has created a foundation that combats censorship across the world, including in Russia. So I'd like to ask the co-founders of the Russian internet, are you engaged in some socially significant activities? Are you doing something for the good of the global community? And if you don't, what prevents you from doing that? I guess we're going to have to take this question. Well, I can take part of the question, because as far as the .su domain is concerned, it's overseen by the Internet Development Foundation. And the foundation runs various researches, publishes magazines on cybersecurity. It also develops textbooks for school kids, their parents, and high school teachers. The internet per se can be dangerous, especially for kids. So this is one of the initiatives that we pursue. As for the efforts, we do our best. Elena, go ahead. Mikhail and I had a very heated debate about, so like I said, Mikhail and I had a heated debate about who could be considered to be a co-founder or the founding father. Well, someone called me a founding mother of the internet, but I have nothing to do with parenting the internet. Anyway, this is a rhetorical question because Alexander is quite active in the RIPE community and the Russian internet community. I'd like to remind him of some socially significant initiatives that we have come up. Well, a couple of years ago, we started publishing a magazine which is titled Internet Behind the Curtains, and being a member of the editorial board, I'd like to mention that we have managed to achieve all the objectives that we have specified. This magazine is quite interesting. Its content is interesting and relevant for the Russian internet community.
And then the second initiative is the foundation of the Internet Research Fund. Its data is published online, publicly accessible. It shows how our internet works in Russia, our Russian internet works, and I think that this is another initiative we can be proud of. Moderator Alexander, you wanted to say something. Please go ahead. Alexander Sherbakov, hello. .Moskva.Moscow registry. Dear colleagues, well, I've been looking at this for a long time here, at things that are happening with DNS, with domains, etc. And I am starting to have some concerns, and I'm hoping that you will either share them or make me worry less. So really, the most resilient systems are the most simple ones. Internet is becoming more and more complex because it's evolving. So let's look at the simplest of examples. That's something that's become a de facto standard, and that is the DNSSEC. It was created back when there was a cache attack issue in place, right? So there was a technology put in place, not very sort of simple and linear for users, and experience has shown that unless you push it, it's not being adopted, right? So, but in any event, it was introduced as some sort of a standard, and it's a rather complicated mechanism, and it really complicated the DNS. However, I was listening to yesterday's speakers, and I drew the following conclusion, that there is a new approach being taken under the guise of privacy protection in order to not be able to see where people are going, right? There is encoding being done, DNS over HTTPS, over DLS, etc. And so I would like to understand and see what you view as, where should we stop, right? There is an issue a problem, how do you counter it, right? At what point do you stop? The DNS attacks are there, but you create a whole DNSSEC mechanism that you created to counter it, and I think it was too much. So same story here is what I'm observing with making these things even more secret and hidden. Dmitry, well, over the past 25 years, there is no protocol that's been implemented worldwide. It's not anything that I knew that I'm telling you, and I think it applies to DNS as well. But I do believe that in the state it is in, it's becoming dangerous. I said this 10 years ago, but in terms of secretive hiding things, I think, yesterday there was a mention of Quick. Maybe it's Quick that's gonna stop operating Google's and not DNS over HTTPS, etc. But I think that people are pragmatic, and if you speak of traffic and stuff and protocol, I mean, even without DNS, there's like 40 to 60 queries that don't go anywhere. Otherwise, there's no curator here. Otherwise, we'll have more specific statistics. David will be able to give you more data with a day in the internet, right? So data. There are a lot of requests that go nowhere. If you think that internet is an ideal system, you're wrong. Plenty of the non-working things are there. You've got. I really don't believe that we can synchronize our entire planet. There's been attempts made. With the KSK, right? This is really an attempt at synchronizing things. There was a presentation on that yesterday too. Even that took several attempts. But really, if you're being objective, right? You've got ZSK and KSK that isn't actually in place. It's just an artificial solution, just because really there is no way to synchronize implementation worldwide. David, you have the floor. Thank you.
When the DNS was first created, the internet was a very different place, and there were certain assumptions that were made that turned out to not be safe. As the internet grew, as the bandwidth increased, as CPUs became faster. DNSSEC is one of the most offensive hacks I've ever seen done to a protocol. It's miserable in almost every way. The only thing that's worse is not having the protections that DNSSEC actually provides. It does add significant complexity to the DNS protocol itself. It does add significant pain for operations, people who are trying to run registries or maintain their own zones. Using DNSSEC just makes life much more painful. But that, I believe, is actually a function of the immaturity of the tools. DNSSEC and the DNS itself was largely the colloquial term in the U.S. is erector set. It's sort of pieced together by kids, and it has evolved over time. And the tools are getting a lot better. In particular, the software that's made by the folks at CZNIC actually handles the signing quite well. The question about DNS over HTTPS is actually reflects one of the sort of the ongoing battles that has occurred within sort of the DNS technical community. DNSSEC protects the DNS data so that no matter where you get the data from, you have the ability to verify that it hasn't been modified in flight. DNS over HTTP or DO protects the channel. It actually encrypts the channel. It ensures that people can't eavesdrop over your DNS queries, so you have some protection against people who are snooping the wire. And because it's encrypted, it does mean that people can't insert bad data in that in the stream. But it doesn't actually protect the data itself. If the data is sitting resident on someplace, if it's data that is like on disk or something, it can be modified and you'll have no way of verifying that it had been modified. So the DNS over HTTPS and DNSSEC actually solve very different problems. Unfortunately, they do add additional complexity. But hopefully the tools that are being developed today will address, at least hopefully minimize the number of ways that people can hurt themselves with their new tools.
Thank you, David. Коллеги, наше время истекло, круглый стол заканчивается. Всем большое спасибо. Сейчас перерыв.
Thank you all. This draws this panel to a close. We're going to have a break now, and we'll resume at noon. Thank you very much.
I beg your pardon, I've tried to change your